earlier in the day, we heard from Professor Munchie about how in the 1920s and 30s, courts adjudicated who was and wasn't white by examining their photographs. What happens to that border between white and other when you add DNA and genetic testing? If you were a white supremacist, someone whose core identity turns on your being white and not other, how would you approach genetic testing? And more generally, how would you talk about, define, and interpret whiteness? So for reflections on this border between the white, the non-immigrant, and the immigrant, I am thrilled to be joined by Joan Donovan of the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics. Joan.
Really exciting to be here, and I often hate to be slotted between people's afternoon coffee, so we'll go fast. But let's talk at the reception. So I'm indebted, of course, to my colleagues at the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics, particularly Dr. Aaron Panofsky and Chris Kelty, for taking me on as their postdoc when we decided to research white supremacist use of DNA testing. We were interested in thinking about, well, what is happening in the field of genetics? How are people redefining their identities? We know that work on Native American communities by Kim Tallbear and work by Alondra Nelson on African American communities, that people are using these genetic ancestry testings to give them genetic ancestry tests to give them a sense of self and a new sense of identity. But we're also wondering, well, why is nobody studying the uptake of these tests by white people? But not just any kind of white people, white supremacists. We wanted to know what could be done using genetic ancestry testing to make sense of white identity, but also whiteness as a political project. And we started this project in 2015, right as things started to coincide with Trump's candidacy, and we started to see a rise and uptick in American white nationalist social movements. And so not only did we collect the data on genetic ancestry tests, and these are just tests that you've seen commercials for, the 23andMe, Ancestry.com. Perhaps some of you have taken them and been surprised that you're partially Hungarian or to that effect. I know my Irish family was a little surprised to find out that we are part Hungarian. The hidden past, right? So I've been invited and thankful to the Center for Privacy and Technology to talk about, well, what does it mean to be white? And I'm going to address, because I'm also a scholar of social movements, how we should study the twin emergence of what we are now calling the alt-right and Trump's presidency. But for many of you that have been in the game for a long time, this is just, your classic re-envisioning or rebranding of white supremacist movements and the Klan that we know. So one of the things that we did in studying it is we made a little map about how people take these tests and react. And I'm going to go through this map. So you take this DNA test and you come back with results. Either you get good news, which confirms, and this is for white supremacists, but some white people in here might feel a little awkward. So you get your white European ancestry test results and you confirm your identity. Nothing new to see here. Maybe you say, oh, maybe this testing company is not that great. I didn't get the spices and herbs. Or you have a pleasant surprise. In some cases, they find out that they're whiter than they thought they were. And these cases they get closer to Nordic ancestry, Scandinavian ancestry. They may wonder why they don't have blonde hair. But that's fairly well contained and actually isn't a very common way that the results come back. More often, people get bad news where there's some non-white DNA or non-European ancestry, and they can reject the bad news, which is very common. They'll reject genetic ancestry testing, typically as a Jewish multicultural conspiracy to control the world, which is a familiar refrain, so it's not that difficult to break the frame of the white nationalist social movement, particularly because 23andMe is owned by Jewish people. So all of it falls in line with this kind of multicultural conspiracy. Or they'll say, and this is where it's interesting as a science studies scholar, they'll say, well, their scientific information is incorrect. If we start to re-narrate how migration patterns happened, that we can see that other people are also white, and therefore these tests don't necessarily tell us much about what it means to be white so much as are good markers of what it means to be European. And I was very interested in the presentations this morning about similar ways of marking whiteness. But then they can accept the bad news, and this is where the trolling comes in. People will come in and say, someone will say, oh, I've got 64% European blood, I'm still committed to the white race, and people will say, you're not white, get out of here, you're a troll. Or they'll redefine white nationalism entirely, and what we've come to start to talk about is these different ways in which people narrate whiteness, or they give themselves a kind of white identity. And depending upon what their DNA test results come back, or even if they refuse to do a DNA test, we can start to see how these definitions of white identity conflict with one another. So these are the ways in which you can tell I'm a sociologist here, because I'm like, I got to get my ideal types in order. So phenotypically, white is very much about physical traits such as skin, hair, eye color. People say, well, if you want to know if you're white, look in the mirror. That's a claim about phenotype. People will say they're quantitatively white. That is, percentages or fractions matter, right? I'm half Italian. I'm 1/4 Irish. These kinds of ways of narrating whiteness. Bureaucratically white is interesting, especially from the presentation we had on census records, where people will rely on census genealogy records, even records of, from the town hall proving your parents had been here and their grandparents had been here. So that's a kind of bureaucratic claim to whiteness. Culturally white is around nationality, heritage, values, and then we're marking the new category of genotypically white, where people use genetic ancestry tests to uncover and make claims about their European lineage. And what's interesting to me about these kinds of ways of narrating whiteness is that they're also reservoirs of power and privilege that not all ethnicities or races can claim, right? We know from earlier presentations today that Hindus are not able to claim phenotypical whiteness, and we know that census records have routinely been lost, not just census records, but also town hall records, birth certificates, any kind of bureaucratic record that you could use to establish who you are and where you belong, especially even the granting and not granting of passports. So these are the things that we've been marking, and then I've been thinking about it not just in terms of the way that white nationalists have been using genetic ancestry tests, but also thinking about the rise of Trump and the alt-right. How can we explain these claims about genotypical whiteness while looking at the broader context of American nationalism today? And I really want to try to answer the question eventually is, why are people so confused about being white, right? It's like the most marked category. So what is the white nationalist worldview? This is something we use to try to help us explain policy recommendations and the ways in which people depend on their whiteness in order to talk about and narrate what it also means to be American. So we talk in our lab a lot about isolationism, protectionism, paternalism, and national security, which are all foundational components of the Trump platform, which were used to motivate and bring into being a kind of white nationalist movement. And so I don't want to say that the alt-right is the reason that Trump won, nor do I want to say that the alt-right could have existed if Hillary Clinton had won, right? Both get a bump from each other. And one of the obvious characters at the head of this new white identity movement is Richard Spencer, who talks about a European kind of nationalism in America, where he describes it as a place of blood and a spirit, where the place is America, The blood is European, and the spirit is one of conquest and empire. And the goal of this kind of identity movement is to relish white privilege, right? To not lose it, to not insist on the kinds of things that identity movements have insisted on for decades, such as justice, dignity, fairness, but rather keeping the status quo in check or strengthening it. So I prefer to call these instead of saying the alt-right, I prefer to call them network nationalisms, because it's actually very much like a social movement where there are competing frames. And so when I talk about this, I think about civic nationalism as, you've seen these free speech protests come out, the anti-Sharia protests. These are all a form of civic nationalism where people are talking about we need to return to the Constitution and common law. And this sometimes conflicts with a kind of ethno-nationalism, which I'll talk about in a second, and civilizationism, which is a new form of nationalism coming through the... but it's like a pan-Europeanism that's starting to emerge, where people are talking about survival against threats to a Western way of life, including it's very anti-Muslim. And then the anti-globalism is very much part of the white nationalism that we know, where globalism is code or a dog whistle for anti-Semitism. And of course, the state-making apparatus of Make America Great Again was often reworded and reframed as Make America White Again. And even though we all knew that this was happening, there was very little we could do to stop it. So one of the interesting questions that I'm now starting to explore is, why does white supremacy thrive online? There's a great book called Cyber Racism by Jesse Daniels, where we know that information is free, but speech in public has costs. And so when we look at the rise of a white nationalist movement and why people are coming out into public, we have to remember that they thrive online because of the same things that make all our other great movements thrive online, whereas there's places for anonymity, identity, and emotional support. There's infrastructural stability within and across platforms, that is, they know where to find each other. And then identifying as a nationalist or a racial realist in public is something that people are more and more comfortable with right now. And this is just some pictures from a recent March 25th protest in Southern California, where white nationalists came out in public, literally sang the American anthem and released white doves. I mean, the spectacle is real. You had women leading the protests, adorable, deplorable. You have young men, shirts off, draped in American flags, knowing that they're the silent majority, right, celebrating that. Defend America. And then this one is an interesting picture because it's pulled from the LA Times. And here you have someone that is not afraid of surveillance, right? This is someone that's wearing brass knuckles and is turning back and grinning into the camera. And I'll call your attention to, in this picture as well, the black and white flag with the thin blue line in it shows us that this is not the kind of movement that is going to be easily fought, because embedded within the movement itself is the Blue Lives Matter movement. And this is something that we don't often speak about, and we definitely get sidetracked when we start talking about Richard Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos or any of the other alt-right figureheads. But we need to start paying attention to their signaling and them in public. And so I guess I'll wrap up around saying that I don't think we're headed towards a biological or genetic determinism, but I think that we're in the midst of a white identity politics that relies on the maintenance of power and privilege over equality for all. And what's lost when we allow white nationalists or white identity movements to thrive, that is, when we don't challenge them in public, when we don't call them by name, what is lost is democracy in America. But thankfully, Tocqueville, when he wrote his Democracy in America, he reminded us the most outstanding Americans are seldom summoned to public office. Thank you.